A promise, I'm back. Good evening once again. Welcome to today's video where we're going to be looking at what we call the anatomy of the stomach. Let's go ahead and get started. In the study of what we call the stomach anatomy, we're going to be looking at the anatomy of the stomach. We look at the bordering structures. We're also going to be looking at what we call the functions of the stomach. Okay? So now, looking at the stomach is going to be one of the parts of what we call the alimentary canal, and the structure which is going to be located between the esophagus and even also what we call the first segment of the small intestine, which we call the duodenum. And this structure is going to be a J-shaped structure, and it's going to be having this kind of the arrangement of different parts. Now, when you see the whole of this structure here, just here, the whole of this structure here, this is what we call the cardia. Okay, the whole of this area here is what we call the cardia. Okay, is what we call the cardia. And then when you see this kind of the dome-shaped structure here, you know how this structure is called? This structure here is what we call the fundus. Okay, is what we call the fundus, and the fundus is very important in keeping the indigested food temporarily, and even also what we call gases. It stores food temporarily, and even what we call the gases, and even also when we talk about the cardia, is going to be the one regulating how much of the food enters what we call the stomach. And of course, this kind of the cardia is going to be housing what we call a sphincter. And that sphincter, we call it the cardiac sphincter or the lower esophageal sphincter, that regulates how much of the food enters into what we call the stomach. It is such a beautiful thing, okay? Then after what we call the fundus, we're going to be having this kind of the big structure. You see the whole of this green structure here. This kind of the portion of the stomach is what we call the body. Or even some people call it what we call the corpus. Okay, so now it is the largest part of what we call the stomach, and this is the area that's going to be having a biggest percentage of the gastric secretion going to be coming from what we call the body. And this area also provides a safe environment for what we call chemical and then mechanical digestion. This is such another beautiful thing. Okay, then when we come down here, just next to the body, we have this area here. You know how this area is called? This area here is what we call the pyloric, antrum. Okay, the pyloric antrum. And then just next to the pyloric antrum, we have again this structure. You know how this structure is called? This structure here is what we call pyloric. Pyloric canal. Okay, you may find some people calling it the pylorus canal. Okay, so now this area is also super very important. Like for example, the pyloric antrum, it has specific cells which you call the G cells that produces a chemical substance called the gastrin that stimulate the parietal cell to release different kind of the gastric secretions. And even also what we call the pyloric canal, this is one which is going to be allowing the exit of what we call the chyme into the first segment of the small intestine, which we call the duodenum. So now generally, the strongest peristaltic contractions or the strongest peristaltic movement within the stomach is going to be taking place within what we call the antrum. That's where we are going to be having extensive, too much strong contractions to propel the food to bypass this kind of the sphincter. You know how this sphincter is called? This sphincter here is what we call the pyloric. Sphincter. Okay, what we call the pyloric sphincter. It is one which regulates how much of the chyme leaves the stomach into what we call the duodenum. It is such another beautiful thing. Okay, and of course in the babies we find this kind of the sphincter when it is stenosed, we will lead the condition which we call pyloric stenosis, whereby it is going to be presenting what we call projectile vomiting, whereby things are not to be crossing this kind of sphincter. It is also such another beautiful thing. Okay. However, in the pyloric antrum, whenever there is that kind of the strong contractions, a very little of the chyme is going to be bypassing the sphincter into the duodenum. But it's going to be now back movement of some of the chyme for proper digestion in what we call the body. You know how this one is called? This is what we call retropulsion, the back movement of the food into what we call the body for proper digestion. This is such another beautiful thing. Okay. And then, of course, here, as we move to the cardia, just the whole of this upper part here. This part here is what we call the esophagus. Okay, this is going to be what we call the esophagus. Okay, what we call the esophagus. Okay, And then also have this curvature. Okay, we have this curvature here, and even also this curvature. How do we call this curvature here? This one here is what we call the lesser, curvature. Okay, what we call the lesser curvature. And then this one here, which is very, very, very great. Okay, this one here, which is very, very, very great. You know how this curvature is called? This curvature here is what we call the greater, curvature. Okay, is what we call the greater curvature. So now this illustrates the anatomical parts of what we call the stomach. Let's go ahead and look at what we call the functions of the stomach. The stomach is super very important in a way that it helps in the process of what we call digestion. Okay, so now the first function of the stomach is going to be what we call digestion. Okay, and of course with digestion, this is the process by which food, the complex food substance is broken down into the tiny molecules that can be absorbed into the body. But this is going to be happening in two forms. We have what we call chemical digestion, and even also what we call mechanical digestion. And of course, chemical digestion is going to be the use of enzymes to break the food down into the simplest molecule that can be absorbed. And when we talk of mechanical digestion, this is going to be involving the use of muscles, even the teeth, that aids in what we call mechanical digestion. And of course, for the case of the mechanical digestion in the stomach, it's going to be by use of what we call muscles, and that kind of what we call the churning. Okay, the muscular contraction of the stomach to make sure that food is churned down into tiny molecules that gets excited into what we call the first segment of the small intestine. It is such another beautiful thing. Okay, and then another function of the stomach is what we call secretion. Okay, is what we call secretion. And of course, the stomach is going to be producing a lot of the secretions, the like of the gastric acid, like the hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen, the lingual lipases, and a lot of the mucuses that protects the stomach. And of course, all those kind of the secretions are going to be very, very, very significant. Like for example, the hydrochloric acid, it does the unfolding of what we call the three-dimensional structure of the protein. It also activates pepsinogen to pepsin that starts chopping up, breaking down what we call the proteins in a chemical form. Okay, this is such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now another function of what we call the stomach is going to be what we call storage. Okay, is what we call storage. And of course, the stomach is going to be storing food temporarily as the process of chemical and then mechanical digestion is taking place. Okay, so now generally these are going to be the major functions of what we call the stomach. So now let's look at what are those bordering structures, the relations of the stomach. Okay, what are those structures we're going to be finding on the posterior aspect, anterior aspect, the superior, and then even also what we call the superior. Now, when we come to the posterior aspect of the stomach, what are some of those structures that we're going to be finding there? This can also be called the stomach bed, okay? Can also be called the stomach bed. Some of the structures which are going to be finding there, the most important one which I want you not to forget, we have what we call the spleen, okay? We are going to be finding the spleen. We are going to be finding what we call the left kidney, okay? We're going to be finding what we call the left kidney, and even also we shall find what we call the tail of the pancreas. Okay, the tail of the pancreas, and even also going to be finding what we call the adrenal gland of the left kidney. Okay, so now all of those ones are going to be located on what we call the posterior aspect of what we call the stomach bed. Okay, and then when we talk about the anterior part of the stomach, here we are going to be mainly looking at what we call what we call the liver. Okay, the liver, especially the left lobe. Okay, especially what we call the left lobe. And even also, you're going to be finding a very very small portion of what we call the diaphragm, because the diaphragm is going to be moving all the way like this. So now we may also see a very small portion of what we call the diaphragm. Okay. And then when we talk of the superior aspect at the top of what we call the stomach, which kind of the structure do we find on the top of the what we call the stomach? The most prominent part, which is located on the superior aspect of the stomach, is what we call the diaphragm. Okay, here we are going to be looking mainly what we call the diaphragm. Okay, one of the most important inspiratory muscles, which you are going to be seeing here in what we call the top part or the superior aspect of what we call the stomach. Okay, and then on the inferior aspect, okay, on the inferior aspect of the stomach, just below here, which are those structures are we going to be finding there? The most important one, which I want you to note, is that we are going to be finding what we call the pancreas. Okay, we're going to be seeing what we call the pancreas. We are also going to be seeing what we call the transverse, colon. Okay, the transverse colon, and even also we are going to be seeing also a very big portion of what we call the duodenum. Okay, what we call the duodenum. A small piece of what we call the duodenum can also be seen in what we call the inferior aspect of what we call the stomach. So now this briefly covers the really anatomy of the stomach, and of course in the next video we are going to be tackling on what we call the layers of the stomach. We shall go deep inside and see the layers of the stomach. And if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please you can support me, and you can do that by a couple of means. You like the video, comment down in the comment section and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. TUMNAD as always. Until we meet next time.